Election of 1816. Okay, what two parties do we have running for elections now? Does anybody remember? Republicans and Federalists, very good. The Republicans in this election nominate James Monroe. And James Monroe was currently serving as the Secretary of State under President Madison. So the Republican Party will nominate James Monroe for the presidency, and he was currently serving as Secretary of State for President Madison. Monroe picked a fellow by the name of Daniel D. Tompkins as his running mate. Daniel D. Tompkins will run for vice president for the Republicans. So you're going to have a Monroe-Tompkins Republican ticket for president in 1816. Now I'll tell you what, the Federalists are really stretching here. You remember Rufus King? I mean, we're way back. Rufus King was involved in politics back in the day, so to speak, in the 1800s. And the Federalists actually countered with Rufus King for president. And his running mate would be John E. Howard as vice president. So you got Rufus King, who has not had any success in any kind of elections for the presidency or vice presidency in the past, who's going to run on the Federalist Party for president, and his running mate will be John E. Howard. So it'll be a Monroe-Tompkins ticket for the Republicans and a King-Howard ticket for the Federalists. Now, as you can imagine, since no one's really heard of Rufus King other than the lectures we've had, the Federalist Party just got crushed in this election. They only won 3 states. Only 3 states. And Monroe earned 183 electoral votes compared to that to 34 that King got. So this was a big-time victory for the Republicans, as the Federalist Party only won 3 states. Monroe earned 183 electoral votes. King earned 34. So James Monroe became the nation's 5th president of the United States. And his administration would be referred to in American history as, quote, an era of good feelings. An era of good feelings. So James Monroe, as a result of the election of 1816, becomes the nation's 5th president, and his presidential administration would go down in history known as an era of good feelings. Okay, so we have a new president, President James Monroe. Okay, that'll take us to a new subtopic, which is entitled The American System. The American System. Anybody want to guess what that has to do with? What's the American system have to do with in our nation? Creating a strong what? What's that? No, not yet. It's a good guess. The American system was an idea that in 1816 Henry Clay came up with. Remember we talked about Henry Clay? Republican from Kentucky. Entered Congress 1811, favored the War of 1812, was a very persuasive, a very what? Distinguished speaker. And this, you'll hear a lot about him. He was a very solid person in the Republican Party. And in 1816, Henry Clay insisted that the nation create a strong economic program. And this program, he stated, if built correctly, would enable the United States to become independent of the rest of the world, become the leading country in the world. Aren't we known today as the strongest country in the world? Well, Henry Clay started this notion in 1816 when he insisted that the United States of America create a strong economic program. And he said that if we did create a strong economic program, it would enable the United States to become independent of the rest of the world. And the name he gave this economic program was what? The American System. So again, in 1816, The Republican Party and Henry Clay insisted that the United States of America create a strong economic program. This economic program would allow the United States to become independent of the rest of the world, and this economic program would be known as the American system. And the American system that was established by parts of Henry Clay rested on three major foundations. Here are the three major foundations that would allow the United States to have a strong economic program that would in turn make us independent from the rest of the world. Now, economics kind of has to do with what? What do you think when you think of economics? What's the first thing you think of? Money. And where do you put money? In a bank. So the first foundation of this new American system would be the creation of the second National Bank of the United States. Do you remember the first National Bank of the United States? Who created that? You remember? Alexander Hamilton. Very good, Maddie. And when he was putting the nation on solid foundations. Well, that charter that was established way back during the Alexander Hamilton years was set to expire, or did expire actually, in 1811. So really, the first Bank of the United States' charter expired in 1811. So we're talking about 1816. What do you think happened during those 5 years when we had no National Bank of the United States? What happened? What happened to all that money? Think about that. We got no national bank.
All the money was lost.
Well, it wasn't lost, but what happened is lawmakers from various states granted permission for individuals to organize and operate their own banks, kind of like we see now. A and B Bank is owned by somebody, not the government, right? Pinnacle Bank is owned by somebody, not the government. Security Bank is owned by somebody, not the government. Those are examples of individually owned banks. Well, prior to this, we had a National Bank of the United States, and we had the banking system ran through the government. Well, when the charter of the first Bank of the United States expired in 1811, individuals were allowed to operate their own banks. Well, what do you think happened? All of a sudden we went from very few banks to what? A lot of them. Matter of fact, the number of banks increased dramatically. Now, it's kind of like a football team. Would you rather have 60 kids out that didn't work very hard and try to win games, or would you rather have 25 really committed kids out that were willing to win? Okay? Well, that's going to happen with these banks. Most of these new banks, and there are too many of them, were poorly regulated. In other words, they had 60 players out and nobody wanted to work very hard. They had too many banks out and none of them operated very well. And this caused a very unhealthy financial situation in the United States. So when Henry Clay basically studied that and said, wait a minute, we've got a very unhealthy banking system. And as a result of that, if we're going to get this American system set up and get our country on solid economic foundations so we can be independent from the rest of the world, we better think about creating the second National Bank of the United States. And that's what they did. That was the first foundation of Henry Clay's American system, was to recharter and form the second National Bank of the United States. So, because these new state banks were poorly regulated, it caused a very unhealthy financial situation in the United States, Henry Clay knew the only way we were going to become economically sound and be able to be separated from the rest of the world financially was to create the second National Bank of the United States, which it did. So now we have another Bank of the United States. And all those poorly regulated individual banks shut down. Okay? Now, another thing that Henry Clay thought was a big foundation to get us lined out economically was to place a protective tariff on goods that were being shipped into the United States. He felt we should put a protective tariff on goods that were being shipped into the United States, especially manufactured goods. In other words, goods that were made in factories. Because we were trying to develop our own factory system, right? So we would prefer the people in the United States buy things from what? Our factories rather than manufactured factories overseas. So he said, let's put a protective tariff. What's a protective tariff? Tax. In other words, we're going to put a high tax on everything that comes into the United States, manufactured goods, so people will be more apt to buy things from our factories than foreign factories. Is that kind of what Donald Trump's promising now, that we're going to quit sending our stuff overseas, right? Although he was one of the biggest ones that did that, by the way, in his business. But the point makes sense. So the second foundation of the American system was to place a protective tariff that would place a very high tax on manufactured goods that were being shipped into the United States. So, we talked about all these new factories that sprung up across the United States because of the Industrial Revolution. And prior to these American factories springing up, where did citizens get their goods? From mainly British factories. Now, because they now faced competition in America, what do you think these British factories did? This is the reason why they put this protective tariff in. What'd they do? What did British factories do? What? Lowered them. Very good, Taylor. They lowered their prices below their own cost to try to drive rival American manufacturers out of business. Okay? So I will tell you that Amazon.com ruins local economies, because you can go into Radio Shack and look at a TV that costs $699 because Mr. Frederick is trying to make a living, and then you can find the same TV for $399 on Amazon, and because Amazon sells so many more things, they can take a loss on certain items and then make a profit on others. And that's kind of what the British were doing, okay? They began to sell their products below their cost so that people would buy things from them. If they bought things from them, even though they were taking a loss, what would happen to these British or these American factories? They go out of business because nobody's buying anything. So they were going to take a loss, take a loss, take a loss, and then when these American factories shut down, what do you think they were going to do with those prices, Taylor? Jack them up higher than they even were in the first place and make up their loss with great profits. So that's why Henry Clay thought we should put a protective tariff or high tax on all manufactured goods that were coming into the United States. Well, when American factory owners saw these British factories doing this to them, that's when they cried to the government, which they should have, and that's why this protective tariff was placed. And the official name of that tariff was the Tariff Act of 1860. That was the official name of the protective tariff that was placed on manufactured goods that were being shipped into the United States. And Henry Clay was a smart man. He thought, we better do something about this if we're going to be able to be strong economically. We'd rather run the British factories out of business than our own. So this is where the protective tax came in. And again, it was officially called the Tariff Act of 1860. What did it do? It placed a very high tax on all manufactured goods coming into the United States, so people would buy from our factories. Okay? Pretty smart. Now we're going to get into the third foundation, which kind of tied into what Paris said earlier with her guess on the American system was the transportation system. Actually, the transportation system is the third part of the American system. Okay? So what Henry Clay believed is if we were going to have strong foundations economically and separate ourselves from the rest of the world, make us more independent, and develop this American system, the third foundation was to develop a good transportation system that would increase trade between Eastern manufacturers and who that lived in the West and the South. Because We were having all this trouble. Remember the Whiskey Rebellion? Farmers that lived in the South and the West. We didn't have a very good transportation system ever to this point for farmers to get their goods east. Remember, we finally took them around, right, the Gulf of Mexico and Florida and around that way, but that's kind of expensive and cumbersome. We just never had a good transportation system that would increase trade between Eastern manufacturers and farmers in the West and South. And Henry Clay said, if we're going to be strong economically, we better develop a good transportation system that makes it easier for our farmers to get their goods to the Eastern merchants, okay? Now, you got to remember, we've had some changes in the West. Between 1810 and 1820, the population of the United States west of the Appalachian Mountains, in this area here, from 1810 to 1820, the population of this area of the country doubled to about 2 million people. There were 2 million people that were living west of the Appalachians and east of the Mississippi River in these areas, okay? That was a lot of people. Earlier than that, most of the people lived where? East of the Appalachians. So between 1810 and 1820, the population west of the Appalachians doubled. It's more than 2 million. So it was crucial, and Henry Clay could see this, that we needed better transportation. Now, in 1791, how many states did we have in this country? 1791. 13. Okay? Since 1791, 9 new states were now part of the United States as we're talking. So actually, as we're speaking about this time period in history, there are 22 states that make up the United States. You are pretty familiar with the 13 colonies that became states. I'm going to list these 9 states and what year they came into the Union. Okay? So since 1791, 9 new states entered the Union, bringing the total of 22. First one that came in was Vermont. Vermont came in 1791. Vermont. One of the first states, the first state to come in other than what? The 13 original. Okay? Vermont, 1791. The next state admitted in 1792 was Kentucky. Kentucky came in 1792. Now as we're kind of looking at the map and thinking, I'll let you try to maybe guess the next 7. Anybody have a guess at what state came in? Tennessee. 1796. Tennessee. Anybody want to throw another one out there? Don't be bashful. Alabama, 1819. Not a girl. Alabama, 1819. Another guess? See if we know our states. Anybody? Rasmussen? Ohio, 1803. Indiana, 1816. Any other guesses? We not know our geography very well. Mississippi, 1817. 2 more.
Oh man.
Not yet. We'll get to that.
Michigan?
Not yet. 1 north and 1 south. Not yet. Had a pretty important port city in this one. Louisiana, 1812. And the last one of the biggest cities in America, is stationed there in the Great Lakes. Have a bad football team right now. Illinois. Very good. Illinois. So we got Vermont, 1791, Kentucky, 1792, Tennessee, 1796, Ohio, 1803, Louisiana, 1812, Indiana, 1816, Mississippi, 1817, Illinois, 1818, and finally Alabama in 1819. Now, during that 28-year period of time, from 1781 to 1791 to 1820. During that period of time, these western settlers who lived west of the Appalachians depended entirely upon rivers or very, very poor roads for transportation. And because of the impact of more states into the Union, a good transportation system was needed if we were going to create a sound, economic federal government. So, does anybody know what this transportation system we developed, which began in 1806, was called? The construction of the Cumberland Road. So, the Cumberland Road began construction in 1806. Actually, before Clay got on his soapbox. But what did he do? He pushed to get things done, because it was a slow project. Does anybody know the original Cumberland Road, where it went to and from? Anybody know where it started? It started in Cumberland, Maryland. Cumberland, Maryland. Where's Maryland out here? Right here? And it stretched all the way to West Virginia. Not very far. So the first Cumberland Road started in 1806, the construction, and it made its way all the way to through West Virginia. Well, in 1811, they continued the Cumberland Road from West Virginia, and it actually went as far as Ohio before it was halted again. So it starts in 1806 in Maryland, they get into West Virginia, they halt for a period of time, they start up again, and they get into Ohio. The construction again is halted.